Hey yo, welcome to our ongoing Ultimate Ableton 11 tutorial series where we're going through all of the ins and outs of the software you need to know to make the epic music you can make at home with this incredible software, as well as jumping in and out of music production techniques, music theory, coming with ideas, mixing tracks, arranging tracks. We're going to get into all of it in this ongoing series. So again, welcome. And as usual, let's start off this video with a quick quote of the day. And the quote of the day today is by Elbert Hubbard. And the quote is, "Art is not a thing, it is a way." And what I'd like you to maybe take away from this quote is whatever modality you're approaching the craft of music production in, whether it's a hobby, whether you're doing it for fun, whether you want to make this a career, a vocation, work with others, if it's just a passion project, whatever it is, I encourage you to find a way to make this part of your lifestyle, to make this part of a holistic mindset in which you can incorporate your art, your practice, your creativity, your expressiveness in your life in a holistic way. Because as you start to explore yourself as an artist, you start creating all these amazing things, you're going to see how everything in your life connects to your art. And what's going to make you and your art special is the unique collection of all the things that add up to being your life. And I want to encourage you to really see your art as that. The unique collection of your life and yourself is the walking rendition of what art is at its true sense. So I hope that this quote can inspire you to find a way of life, find a way for your art that really helps inspire you, helps you live a holistic lifestyle and unlock your artistry to a whole other level. Hey yo, it's Alex from MediMind Music, and as always with this channel, it's my mission to help musicians produce themselves by developing their mindset, expanding their creativity, and connecting to their inner artist in a deeper way. So in this video, we're going to dive deeper into investigating tracks, whether they are MIDI tracks, audio tracks, return tracks, or your master track, and we're going to dive deep into what you can do with them and some of their controls. All right, so what exactly are tracks? Well, tracks hold clips, which we previously covered is what Ableton uses to store ideas, whether they are audio ideas or sequenced MIDI ideas, and we'll get deeper into that as we move along. However, tracks hold clips and also manage the flow of signals. So if we think of a typical studio that you might go to, a fancy studio in your city or your town, a track would typically correspond to one instrument. So for example, you would have one track for your bass, you'd have one track for your guitar, you'd have maybe several tracks for your drum kit, the snare, the kick drum, the overheads, your vocals, your harmonies, so on and so forth. All right, but in Ableton, along with having one track per instrument, you also have multiple clips per track. Tracks are also used for the creation of new clips through recording, through sound synthesis, processing, mixing, all of that good stuff. So in Ableton, we have a few different kinds of tracks. I'm going to quickly go over them right now. We have MIDI tracks, which we briefly covered, will let you host a virtual instrument and program in musical data. We have audio tracks, which will record external audio through your audio interface, whether it's a guitar, whether it's a microphone for a vocal, whether it's an external instrument, whatever it is, it's recording audio signal. We have return tracks, which are typically used for effects and hosting effects, and then sending tracks, whether it's audio tracks or MIDI tracks, to this return track to affect it. And return tracks don't host clips. And then we have the master track, where all of your tracks, your MIDI tracks, audio tracks, your groups, your return tracks are all fed together for the final stereo output, which is what is sent to your headphones. All right, so in arrangement view, you'll see that these tracks are organized vertically and they're represented here. However, if we hit tab and go over to session view, you'll see that the tracks, they're the same tracks, but they're represented in a horizontal fashion. So you'll typically want to put clips that are going to play at different times. So for example, for your intro, for your verse, for your chorus, for maybe bridge section, if your clips are meant to be played at different times, you're typically going to organize them into different clips on the same track. However, if you want clips to be playing at the same time, so let's say you have a bass part, a drum part, a vocal part that all should be playing at the same time for the same section of a song, then you'll organize them in the same row. All right, and this is called a scene in Ableton. So whether you're in session view or arrangement view, you can select different tracks simply by clicking on the track itself, and it will select that track and show you any device, any instrument, any effect that's loaded on that particular track. The same goes for arrangement view, as you can simply select tracks by clicking on them, and it will select that track and pull up the information relevant to that track. You can also right click on a track to rename it whatever you want. And also, if you load in any instrument or preset, it will automatically rename the track for you. Let's talk about the two different types of clips and tracks that you see in Ableton. So to quickly recap, a clip represents a recorded signal or idea, and Ableton works with two types of signals, audio and MIDI. So audio represents a continuous signal of recorded sound, while MIDI is a symbolic representation of musical material. So audio, for example, could be samples, it could be loops, it could be something you recorded live. So for example, if we go to our samples tab here, you have all of these different audio loops that you can select from and drag them or use them with an audio track. So once you find a loop that you like, you can simply click and drag it to the track you want, or you can select a track and you can simply double click on a sample and it will automatically load it onto that track. Just by double clicking the sample, now we have a clip representing that loop on our audio track, and we can play it by clicking this little tiny play button beside the clip. And now we have an audio loop playing on our audio track. All right, I'm gonna hit spacebar to stop playback. You can also record audio into audio tracks. So for example, I could arm this track, put my monitor to auto, and record my voice over this beat. Yeah. Hit stop, and now we have record my voice over this beat. Yeah. And just like that, I recorded my voice to an audio track. We're gonna go over recording audio and performing and editing MIDI in detail later, so don't worry, but I just wanna quickly show you what's possible with an audio track and a MIDI track. So with a MIDI track, however, we can actually select a virtual instrument to load onto that MIDI track to then play around with MIDI information to trigger that instrument. So for example, we could go into the drum section of our browser. We could find a drum kit we like. All right, let's say we like this drum kit. You could simply select a MIDI track, and then you could double click on the drum kit, and it will automatically load onto the selected MIDI track. Now we have an instrument loaded onto our MIDI track, and you can see it in the device view in the bottom section here in Ableton. And this represents the virtual instrument that we just loaded. And I have a MIDI controller set up here, which we will get into later, but I can play the drum kit by triggering MIDI data through this software instrument. So isn't that awesome? You can play absolutely every instrument that's inside of Ableton with a MIDI controller. And then if we wanted to, we could go ahead and record some of that MIDI data. So I'm just going to actually stop these other clips by hitting the little stop button down here. And I'm going to turn these off for now. Just by hitting the track number, we'll turn those tracks off so they don't send their output to the master channel. And we're going to focus on our MIDI track. I'm just going to turn on the metronome, and I'm going to pencil in a quick beat really quick. So I would just simply hit this little circle to record a clip. Just like that, I've recorded a MIDI clip. All right, let's say we wanted to load a different sound on a different MIDI track. Let's select that MIDI track, and let's go into our sounds folder of our browser and look at all these organized categories of sounds. Let's go into synth keys and drop it onto a MIDI track. And you'll see that it automatically loaded the device into the device view, and you can play with the device parameters and all the ways to shape the sound and change it to your liking there, which we won't get into. But with this MIDI track selected and record enabled, which is this red button down here, now I can play my MIDI controller and it's going to trigger this device we just loaded. And alternatively, what we can do instead of recording MIDI in, we can actually edit MIDI in. We can program MIDI notes instead of having to play it with a MIDI controller. So I can simply double click on this clip cell to create a new clip. So I just double clicked on that cell to create this new MIDI clip, and it automatically opened our MIDI editor, which is the other view from our device view. And we can cycle between them on this little tab at the bottom. But with what is called a piano roll open here, we can actually pencil in MIDI notes instead of having to play them in. So a quick little tip, to actually hear the notes that you're penciling in, you have to click this little tiny headphone button. So with that button clicked, now whenever you pencil a note, just by simply double clicking on the piano roll, you'll now hear what you're programming in. So let's say we wanted a note there, we can move over here, put another note there, another one there. And just like that, we've now programmed MIDI information into this clip. Now if I hit play, and don't worry, we're going to cover all of the MIDI editing techniques and the ins and outs of both an audio track and a MIDI track later. However, as you can see, I've just penciled in MIDI notes to create this new MIDI clip. You can also record MIDI clips like what we did here, and I'll double click on this clip to bring it up in our clip view. So here's all the stuff I programmed in with my MIDI controller, just playing it along. You can also drag in samples to an audio track. So I just dragged in a sample from our browser, and here it is represented in the clip view for that audio track. And if I go to this other audio track, here's the recording of my voice that I recorded. All right, and a couple hotkeys that I actually want you to know is how to create a new audio track or create a new MIDI track. So first of all, to create a new MIDI track or audio track, you can go into Create and then Insert Audio Track. That will create a new audio track. You can also go Create, Insert MIDI Track, and that will insert a MIDI track. Alternatively, you can also right-click in this open space here, and you'll see a little context menu pops up. And from this context menu, you can also hit Insert Audio Track. You can do the same thing, Insert MIDI Track. However, I would suggest that you learn the hotkeys. So I'm simply going to select the first one, hold Shift, and select the last track we created, hit Delete to get them out of the way. And I want you to learn these hotkeys. So to create a new audio track, simply hit Shift T. And that will create a new audio track. And if you want to create a new MIDI track, hold Shift Command T. And that will easily create a MIDI track. All right, and keep in mind that for MIDI tracks, if you have an instrument loaded onto the track, you can simply double click on a cell to create a new MIDI clip. All right, so you can keep doing this to create new clips and edit in information, or you could record it like I showed you previously. Another cool thing that you can do with tracks is actually group them and create what is called a sub mixer. So basically what this does is I could select these two tracks that we have by simply selecting one of them, holding Shift, and then clicking the second one. And then I'm going to right click on them. And then you'll notice that there's this little option here called Group Tracks. So if we select that, you'll notice that both of these tracks got combined into a group. You can also right click on here, change the color. You can rename it to whatever you'd like. So let's rename it to Group 1. All right, and the powerful thing about doing this is getting a little bit more into the mixing territory, but it's very handy for production techniques and arrangement techniques as well, is that you can actually control all of the grouped tracks with one single fader, or you could put an effect on a whole group instead of on every individual track. So for example, if I start playback by hitting spacebar once again, notice that I can control the volume of both of our tracks by changing the volume fader of our group track. Next, let's quickly talk about what return tracks are. And return tracks are basically places where you can host effects and cool processing and then send parts of whatever track you want to be affected to that return track. So by default, Ableton loads up a reverb and a delay return track. So for example, on this return track A, we have a reverb sound, all right, which is basically creating a reverberant space, adding some more ambience, some more depth to the sound. So if I wanted to send, let's say, these chords to that reverb return track, I would simply increase the send amount with this send parameter here under send A, which corresponds to the reverb track. So let's play these chords and I'll increase that send so you can hear the reverb effect get added to that sound. So you can hear that ambience, that extra space that's added. But if I take this away, it becomes a lot more direct again. I could do the same thing with the second return track, which has a delay loaded on it. So if I increase the B, you can start to hear distinct echoes, which is called delay. And the power of using a return track is that you can send multiple tracks to one effect instead of having to put that effect on multiple tracks. And you can also process your effects differently. And we'll get into all that in a later lesson. However, it's a good distinction to keep in mind because a lot of people ask, like, why don't you just throw the reverb effect directly on the track that you're working with? Or why don't we just throw the delay directly on the chord track? Well, the advantage is that you can actually process your delay and your reverb and whatever other effect you have on return tracks separately than the instrument that's loaded onto the MIDI or audio. Plus, there's a ton of awesome, creative, fun stuff you can do with sends and returns and playing around with routing to really get creative, to make your mixes super unique, to create really powerful automation, all of that great stuff. So it's a very powerful feature to use with an Ableton is these return tracks. And finally, let's touch on the master fader. And the master fader is basically where all of your tracks get summed up to then get spit out to your headphones. So the master track also controls the volume of every single track. It's basically the last mode of control before it hits your headphones, hits your speakers, or gets exported out of your project. And in session view, you'll notice that the master fader actually has clip cells as well. And what these represent are scenes of clips. So for example, if I would hit play on this first clip scene launch, it would trigger every single clip that's in this first row. So let's do that. Yeah. Record my voice over this beat. Right? Yeah, so by hitting that, it triggered all of these loops. Voice over this beat. Let's hit stop. And just for demonstration, I'm going to delete these clips. And we can actually select both of these clips and hit Command D to duplicate them. Or you can right click and hit duplicate to easily duplicate clips. So now I have a second scene that only has those chords and that drum beat. So if I hit this first scene trigger on the master fader, it's going to trigger the first 4 clips that we see in the top row. Record my voice over this beat. Yeah. But if I hit the second scene launch clip, it's going to just trigger the chords and the drum beat. And to wrap things up, I quickly just want to go over the layout of both a MIDI and audio track so you understand what all the knobs and what everything does. All right, so let's focus in on our drum kit. All right, so I'm just going to hit spacebar to play this. And you'll notice, as we know, this the name of the track is at the top. We have all of our clip cells, which represent different ideas. All right, you'll notice in this little section, we get a little bit of information about the clip that is currently playing. So this first number represents what number of loop it is playing. So if I hit spacebar once again, this number restarts. And when the loop has looped around once, that number will increase to 2, and then 3, so on and so forth. So now we're on the second repetition of this loop. This little circle shows you the playback progress of the current clip before it loops around once again. All right, the second number actually shows you how many beats are inside this clip, and we're going to get into what beats and bars and counting measures and developing rhythm and time signatures and all that fun stuff in a later video. But just know that that number represents how many times you're going to count a beat before your loop repeats. So if I hit spacebar and I start counting every beat, there should be 16 beats before this loop repeats itself. So let's go. All right, next on a MIDI track, you'll see the MIDI input and output selection for that track. And you typically don't have to worry about this too much unless you're playing around with multiple MIDI devices and you want them to communicate on their own channels. Then you might want to get into the nitty-gritty here and select specific MIDI controllers or specific MIDI channels. But don't worry, we're not going to touch that right away, but just know that this is where you're going to route your MIDI inputs and outputs if you so desire. So next is your monitor control, and you actually can turn this off so that you can't actually hear what you're playing. You can turn this to auto, which is typically where you'll want to leave it so you can actually hear playback of the sound as you're playing it. And then monitor in is you can actually listen to the sound before it gets affected in certain capacities. The next section is where the audio of this track is routed to, and you'll notice that it's going to group 1, and that's because we grouped those tracks into a group. So when you group tracks, that means it automatically takes whatever tracks are in that group and routes the audio out to that group, and then the group gets routed to the master track. See how that works? All right, but if you wanted to bypass this, you could select a different output. You could go directly to the master. You could also send this out of your audio interface into external hardware. You can do all sorts of cool stuff with audio routing. And this other MIDI track, since it doesn't have an instrument loaded on it, it actually has no output because there's no musical information to send out anywhere. All right, the next part of a track is what is called the sends of that track. And I showed you how this works a little bit earlier in this video, but this actually will allow you to send signal to how many return tracks you have. So if I right click up here and insert a new return track, for example, you'll notice that a third control pops up on all my tracks to be able to send the signal to that new return track that I just created. So these are what are called sends, which mean sending signal to your return tracks. And your return tracks, again, are up here and typically will host effects. Moving down, we have what is called the fader. And this fader will actually allow you to change the volume of the corresponding track. So for example, I'm going to hit solo on this track so that we're only hearing the drum kit. So for example, if I hit play and I move this fader up and down, I'll be able to control the volume of that track. Next is this little number, and that will actually show you the volume peak of that specific track. That could be useful for certain situations. Next, we have the panning knob, and this will allow you to actually pan your track to either the left or the right. All right, and again, you can double click on the parameter to restore it to its defaults. So the next button is actually the track on off button. And if you hit this button, it will turn faded. And if it's faded, that means the track is off. That means there will be no output coming out of that track. And if you hit this track bypass button once again, it will turn this orange color, and then the track is back on once again. All right, the next button underneath that is the solo button. And this will actually allow you to solo and only listen to certain tracks if multiple tracks are playing. So I'll throw these chords back in. And if I hit the solo button, I'll only be able to hear the drums. Right? It effectively mutes everything else that isn't selected with the solo button. Alternatively, I could just select the chords. And now we're just hearing the chords and the drums have been muted. However, you can hold command and you can solo multiple tracks. So the next button under the solo button is what's called the record arm button. And this is a really important button because the record arm button has to be enabled for you to hear the input of a track. And it's also required if you want to record a clip to that track. It has to be record enabled to then be able to record a clip to. And if we focus on the bottom right hand side of session view, you'll notice that there's all these little buttons here. And what these actually do is either open or collapse certain parameters of your tracks. So for example, I could hit the I/O button and you'll notice that all of my I/O controls have been hidden on my tracks. And this can be useful if you know you're not going to be playing around with the inputs and outputs of your tracks, just to clean up your screen real estate a little bit. You can also do this with your return tracks. You can hide them. You can do this with the send knobs. You can hide them if you want. You can actually do this with all of your major track controls, so the volume fader, the solo button, the record arm button. These are quite important parameters, however, so I don't imagine you'll be using this too often, but there it is if you want. And then we have a few extra things that we haven't actually looked at yet. We have track delay, which is actually useful if you have some latency and you want to fix that, you can use that. There's also an A/B track selector if you feel like mixing between tracks. Similar to what a DJ might do, you can actually select certain tracks to be A tracks, certain tracks to be B tracks, and you can work with a crossfader to fade between them. And then finally, we have a CPU usage meter, which will show you how much CPU each track is using with the plugins, with the instruments, whatever's loaded on the track. So if you want to see that, you can select it here. But I leave those three selected off because you don't typically really need those unless you actually need them. And if we move over to arrangement view, you'll actually see that all of this information is also displayed in arrangement view, just in a different layout. So if we look at this track, we have the inputs here, we have the monitoring selection, we have the output, we have the track on and off selector, solo, record arm, we have our panning, we have our volume, all of that good stuff. And you can enable or disable a few extra things here. We even have our sends right here. It's just a little bit more condensed to give you more room in the arrangement view. And hey, if you're just getting started with music production and feeling completely overwhelmed by the process or having trouble finishing projects, or would just like to get a glimpse inside my personal workflow, which we will be diving deeper into as we move forward through the series, then I created a super easy to follow 7-step framework that helps you go from your very first ideas to finding the best ones, to arranging them, editing it, mixing it, mastering it, to finish your tracks, all in one useful guide. It's super handy to have around the studio as a printout. So if you're interested in grabbing that, the link is below. And that wraps it up for this video. We actually covered just the basic overview of both audio and MIDI tracks, and we investigated a little bit about how to create them, how to navigate them, how to play around with stuff. We're gonna dive deeper into recording audio, recording MIDI, all of that fun stuff as we move forward. But again, I want to keep these short. So if you like this video, give it a like. If you want to stay up to date with all of these new episodes in the series, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. And hey, if you know somebody like a musician or someone who's always been into music that you know would benefit from the series, go ahead and share it with them, because the more the merrier, and we're on this journey together. And let me know if you have any specific questions or anything specific that you'd like me to cover as we move forward. I'm here to help. I'd love to start a conversation in the comments down below. And until the next time, we'll see you in the next one.